Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
It's not about a specific place, or it's not about women's issues specifically, or it's not about a specific issue, but it's just about a portrait of everyday life, and how, yes, people are different, but we all have the same fundamental feelings, and we all have the same human experience. And I think this book kind of does make you feel that way.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 81, also known as the number of squares on a shogi board. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with translator Perween Richards about The Sea Cloak and Other Stories, written by Nayrouz Qarmout. Perween Richards is a literary translator of Arabic language stories. She attended translating classes at City Summer School in London in 2016 and was one of the two winners of the school's annual translation competition, sponsored by Comma Press. She was awarded an English Pen Translates grant to translate The Sea Cloak. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I'm your host, John Monaster. I'm very excited to be talking today with my transatlantic guest on the other side of the ocean via the beautiful Zoom that we all love. And I'm going to be talking with her today about the book The Sea Cloak, written originally by Nayrouz Qarmout and translated by my guest, Perween Richards. Perween, say hello.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being on. I'm really excited. This was quite a book, as we were just talking about. So there's much to kind of unwrap and think about within this book. So why don't we just kick things off? Maybe just tell me, the kind of quick overview of what the book is all about.
So the book is a collection of short stories about the life of Palestinians and people in Gaza, which is sort of, I wouldn't say autobiographical, but the Nayrouz Qarmout grew up in a Syrian refugee camp and eventually moved back to her country, Palestine. And she, writes about life in Gaza for ordinary people, and writes a little bit about history, about, growing up in Gaza under these unusual conditions. And it's really about a group of people who share a very small part of land but live completely different lives.
Yeah, that's such a good way of putting it, because that is one of the things that almost every story that talks about those issues really brings forward is how different everyone's experiences are.
True.
Here. Yeah. But yeah, let's start a little bit about the whole process, because I'm really curious to know. I haven't actually spoken with a translator before on the podcast, so I'm really curious to know about how that works. So just maybe your background as a translator and how you got involved with this project would be great to know.
Okay, so I attended a literary translation course at City University in London, and I had always been interested in translation, and I worked in publishing for a few years. So I think for me it was the natural step, and because I'm a fluent Arabic speaker, that's the language I wanted to translate from Arabic to English. And so Comma Press, who published The Sea Cloak and Other Stories, sponsored a prize, and I was one of two winners, and the prize was to it's a publishing deal for one of their stories. And I chose one of the stories from the book, Our Milk. And that's the first story, the story I entered the competition with. And they liked it and went ahead and published and asked me to publish the others, translate the other stories.
So they had a competition to see who would be the translator for the book?
Yes, for this book and another book. But the other book was an anthology of different authors. And I guess with Nayrouz's book, they had about 14 stories that hadn't been translated. And I was lucky that I chose one where she had written quite a few stories. So they had enough material for a book.
Huh.
And yes.
Okay. Well, there you go. You won. You won the competition. I guess it's always,
Yes.
I guess it's like a job interview. It's always a competition in some way. So,
Yes, because I think it's a really good way to judge something, because if you can't read the original language, then, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to know the original language of the story, as long as it makes sense in English, right? And the work of a literary translator, it is like you're pitching a book yourself, because you find the writer, you find the story, and you think it could translate well, and you want to have it published. So you approach the author and you approach a publisher and, translate a sample, send a proposal, and hopefully they like it.
Yeah.
So this was a bit of a shortcut, but it was great.
Good. I'm glad it worked out. And I noticed that you had, you've done some translation previously. I saw a Banthology.
I have.
How did this translation compare?
Well, I think with Banthology, the story I translated Zahira Marin's story, A Beginner's Guide to Smuggling, about people trying to, people escaping Syria and going to Europe and basically being smuggled on these boats. And obviously it's quite a tragic story, but he wrote about it in a very funny way. And it was, quite... he wrote about it with humor, and it could have been really dark, but he wrote about the kind of guide to being smuggled into Greece, and so it was a funny story, and it was short, but he'd already written it, and it was kind of very straightforward short story. It had a beginning, had an end, and it was also part of an anthology. So I worked on it, and it was one of the stories and it was, I think, after Trump's ban on Muslim countries. And that was a response. The book was a response to Trump's ban on immigration from Muslim countries. And but I think the big difference is his story had already been written. And with Nayrouz's book, she was still in the process of writing. So I would, she would write a story, I would translate it, and sometimes she'd rewrite it, or we'd make another change, because we had the flexibility, because the stories weren't published in Arabic. So,
so no one would know.
Tricky. Yeah, exactly. So I had a lot more work to do, but it was, really exciting to be involved in her writing process and to kind of see the changes that she made. And, it's kind of like just not writing with her, but just seeing how her mind works. It was really interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I mean, do you have a particular example when like she made a particular change that you were surprised by, or like something happened that you wouldn't have thought, but it somehow made sense to her, and then you kind of reconciled?
I think with the story 14th of June, I think it was called, the title was different. That's obviously a small change, but so much of that story was written, I think, from her own perspective, her own point of view, that it was hard for anyone to understand what was going on. And I think it was the first story I translated after Our Milk. And I just thought, oh, this is going to be really tough, because I haven't, I don't understand who the narrator is. The narrator kept changing. Didn't know where everyone was. And when you're translating, you have to be very specific, and you have to understand every single word, because a word, could change the meaning of the sentence, especially in Arabic. And I was kind of taken aback by how much work she actually put into it to try and make it more like readable to other people, because obviously I mean I assumed this had happened to her, happened to someone she knew, and it was really traumatic. So writing about it, you have to make the reader understand what's going on, and I think if it happened to you, it's kind of hard to explain that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting from talking to all of the different writers that I've spoken with on the podcast. I definitely get a sense that there's a lot more editing than you would imagine that goes on. I mean, over
That's
and
right.
over and over again. And so
I think
yeah,
it's worse than the writing, it's
yeah, it almost seems like it. And because what you
yeah.
do is you edit it until it seems perfect, and then when people read it, they're like, "Oh, it's just these magnificent words just flowed right
Yeah.
out," and you sort of it just you
I
miss that
know.
there were 50 intermediate steps to get there. So yeah, I can only
Yeah.
imagine that this was magnified by the way you had to work with her.
Yeah, and as a translator, and especially from Arabic, what you get from the publisher is usually a completely unedited manuscript, because the literary editor in Arabic publishing, they don't really exist.
Hmm.
Writers are very difficult because they don't want anybody to touch their work. And so we don't have editors like, people do in English. So as a
Hmm.
translator, your job is to correct the manuscript and guess what you're trying to say, and edit it a little bit so you can understand what's going on, proofread it, and then kind of send it to publisher who makes more edits.
Wow. I mean, I was going to ask you what the hardest part was, but it sounds like based on what you said, the answer is everything.
Well, I think for Nayrouz specifically, she's extremely talented, and
Hmm.
she's one of the best writers in Arabic I've ever read, and she's so young. I'm really jealous, but she does write very well, and she writes very complicated sentences, and she writes in a kind of without punctuation, without
Mm.
she writes it's all first person present tense, and it's stream of consciousness type writing, so that's really hard to translate.
Yeah.
And I think initially I was a little worried about asking her too many questions, but obviously I realized I can't just guess what she's saying, and I have to speak to
Yeah.
her, and she said, don't be shy, just, we need to work on this together, because you can't understand everything I'm trying to say.
Yeah. No, that's great that she was willing to work with you like that.
No, she
Yeah. I
was
mean, so
extremely generous, to be honest.
yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. So do you get a sense that for the most part, when you say that these stories were told first person,
Mm.
that a lot of it was just based on her experiences and she sort of fictionalized it to some extent?
Some of it, I think, yeah. I mean, I think
Yeah.
so. Obviously, not everything, because a lot of it has happened in the past, and a lot of it, covers things that she probably wouldn't have experienced, like
Yeah.
terrorism, or being shot, and other
Right.
things. Like, I don't think she experienced them, but I think you can always tell when there's a little bit of the writer in the story,
Yeah.
and you know, I always think I'm really good at guessing who's their favorite character. But with Nairoz, it was really tricky, because I think she feels very strongly about all of them.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's interesting. I mean, especially because in some of them there are sort of, I mean, so like Our Milk, for example, the the characters are very well. I mean, they're ephemeral, obviously, because of
Mm.
Our Milk is about terrorist attacks, but
Yeah.
you see these people kind of just spending in the hotel at the King David Hotel, and they're just chatting in between, about a woman is a little irritated about waiting for her milk, and in Sparrows you get to see some of the terrorists like being dropped off, but you just also hear a
Mm.
casual conversation, like, so it's interesting because I think with short stories and with some of these stories that are there's not a lot of time to really connect with a character. Like as a
That's
reader,
right.
at least, you're sort of just
Yeah.
like, okay, something's happening. There are some people here. Oh no, like an explosion. and okay, I need to process what just happened, and you know what I mean. So it's interesting to think about, like, oh, for that story, some of the characters were drawn from the historical, the history.
Yes, some. I mean, I think the bombings. Yeah, I think the Armilk and Sparrow. These were real terrorist attacks. I mean, they were real explosions. Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about, how she might have like favorite characters there. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. But I also think I think with some of them I felt like there was maybe a link between the stories, and maybe not. But I think some of the characters are recurring in a way that, I can see how the trajectory of this young man, he would eventually become, a terrorist maybe, or this person would be so hateful because something terrible happened to them, or not, and it's,
yeah.
I think it takes a real understanding, obviously, of who the people are to write about them in such a different way.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point about kind of a progression, maybe, because there are, if you look at the stories, there are, for example, there like the character of a little girl, for example, you see kind of replicated in many stories.
Yeah.
From Sea Cloak to The Mirror to the 14 June, and there's a lot of stories about little girls and their experiences there. And then you kind of see at the end, like the Summerlin Moon one, it's these two, adults now trying to deal with themselves. So it is interesting to think, like, oh, is that adult woman now drawing from, the experiences that any of these other girls had over the course of the novel?
Yeah, I think we can expect that. I mean, I think, I don't know if, maybe not specifically to her book. Whenever I read a book of short stories by the same author, I always think, oh, like, this is the same character, or this is what happens to her. And it's really hard to not do that. But
yeah, that's true, because your brain just packs it all in at the same time as you're reading. Totally. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Let's jump in and talk about some of these, and maybe see if we can tease out some of those connections. So, like, for example, in Black Grapes, we have a kind of this is a story with men, and we have kind of a young man who is labor and an older man who is management, and they're both kind of sneakily being watched by a old man just kind of hanging out, and there's a conflict. The kind of, this is
about money and how much he's owed.
Yeah, going back to the beginning of time, probably a very typical conflict where labor says, you owe me money, and management says, I don't, too bad. And, but in this case, so to me, this is what really struck me, is that this is a very, it's the type of conversation that happens all the time, of course, all over the world, but
it's universal.
It's universal, exactly. But in this case, again, what I think is brought with the book is the focus on why it's different here in this place in Gaza, is because somebody got angry with someone else and said, like, stop being a terrorist or something, shouted that out. And this old guy who happened to be watching, kind of apparently was a watchdog for the security forces, called them in because he said, oh, someone called someone a terrorist. And then, they stormed in, and it just took over. And, so it was just completely escalated this little situation, in a way that, hopefully in most places around the world, like that wouldn't happen. And I think that was what struck me so much. And so I guess I'm, I don't know, this is probably, again, one that didn't happen to her directly.
No.
But I wonder, if that's based on some semblance of reality. Like, do people really need to walk on eggshells like that to that extent?
Well, I think comes down to one person's word is more valuable than the others. And I guess, you might think, like, I don't know if this is what happens, but it could also, I mean, I guess it happens in America all the time. If you're Black and you're just, minding your own business, and a white woman decides to call the police and say, I feel intimidated, this person could end up dead. And, it just depends who has more influence in the society that you live in. And, it's usually if not the minority, but the person who has, the least amount of rights and whose death isn't going to be a big deal,
Yeah. No, I think that you hit it exactly there. I think that is it. I mean, I think that's a big fear that a lot of minorities, people of color have in the United States, is that, if something escalates, even if they're not the ones that did the escalating, they're the ones
Yeah.
that could face the punishment. And that is what this story is also.
And I think in
flagging.
other societies, it might be, if you have more money, like in other parts of the Arab world, you can call someone a terrorist and they would investigate it, because, the police have bigger powers to arrest, because,
Mhm.
If you say someone is a terrorist, well, there's a good chance they might be a terrorist if another person says they are. It's really hard you need to have a police that is, reasonable and fair and treats everyone equally. And if that's not the case, well, then we can't guarantee what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair. Which is very difficult in a lot of places. And I think, again, and this is, there were actually this is now making me think that actually several other stories kind of played along this theme to some extent.
Yeah. So I think it was White Lilies, where there's somebody buying flowers to go see his mother, and I think by the end of the story he's killed in a drone attack. Or no, there was another person who was actually the person who sold him the flowers years before. And initially, I thought this story was going in a completely different direction.
Yeah.
I thought these two men would eventually become lovers. And that's how I saw it. And then as I read, I said, oh, of course, that's not it. But, you think in another world, this could have been the case. It might have been if we were talking about another country or, another time.
Yeah. Well, and then, of course, it went into, a very, for the book, a very typical dark place. Yeah. And it was just, So eventually this person, one of the people is told to launch a drone attack against someone else. And, I think it's again, similar to Black Grapes. There's that power imbalance there. And it's almost like this, what really struck me about this one was sort of the conditioning that must have happened to the person operating the drone, where they just got an order, they got a signal. I think he sort of like thought about it for just a split second about, well, is that the right thing to do? Or what should, wait a minute, there's some kids around. And then they were like, nope, just go for it. And he was like, okay. And that was it, and then he was just in some remote room and killed someone. And so again, and then you could even, just like you were saying with Summerlin Moon, and so just that power imbalance, the violence is it's very intense here, and
I think it is a violent culture, but this is it. This is like, it's a cycle of violence that just never ends. And if you live in a violent society, and I don't think everyone accepts that. I don't think everyone wants to live in this kind of society, but you're conditioned to believe that it's the only way out, and it's the only way for you to live safely. And I guess most of us just can't understand what that's like.
Well, I think most of us are lucky enough to not have to figure that out.
Exactly.
I mean, I feel very lucky, after reading these stories. So, for example, just to connect with more of the guys. So we have Pen and Notebook, and this story was kind of mind blowing. I mean, it's literally about three kids whose job is just to go and get rocks and then bring them back and sell them to someone for just a little bit of money to keep their family going because their father can't work, and then kind of go and do it again every day. Like, that's literally what they do. And the story is, you see their efforts to find kind of happiness throughout. When one of the kids finds a little play truck, to have, and which ends up helping them later when a police officer pulls them over and he lets them off because he sees the truck and all this stuff. So to me, this was just like, wow, like these kids have what most people would just see as just nothing going for them and having not a great situation, but they seem to fight on, like they make do with what they have. And I think really to me, at least the title of the book, or title of the story, Pen and Notebook, they end with that, like keep saving the money that we're making here to get that pen and notebook. And I guess it made me think that maybe it was about being a writer. I don't know, but what did you take away from that story about how we can stay strong and I guess think about our futures?
Yeah, I think with Pen and Notebook, I think it was really difficult, to read about these children who really don't have anything, and they're really young, and they still have to work after school. And the oldest couldn't finish school because he had to leave school to work and provide for his family. And that's a really tough choice, because it's where do you go from there, and what does your future look like? And I think with writing, so much of writing is, it's hope. And I think some people, when they write, they think they write stories at the worst times of their life. And I think it's a way to kind of escape. And the Pen and Notebook, I kind of felt like that was really it. I think it was, in a way, there was hope, but at the same time, you can see how that could lead you to a very, violent life if you've got nothing to look forward to, and if you've got nothing to live for, and if you don't have money, and if you don't have basic, fundamental, access to education, security, a home, or a family life. I think, that could take you down a really bad road.
Yeah.
And I think
definitely.
That's more what I read into it, that, hopefully these children grow up to be, wonderful and have a wonderful life, but you never know.
Yeah. And it's interesting to connect that now, to connect these boys to then like the story of 14 June, which is these other children and this girl especially. And so, one of the things that really caught me about this story about kind of just a family sort of sequestered in their home, watching all this violence unfold around them, was that, the kids had kind of normalized it to some extent. Like they were sort of watching it, but it didn't frighten them as much as I think their mom wanted. They didn't flinch. So it seems like they had lost their innocence to some degree. And so I guess one of the things that I was thinking about throughout this book is about children in moments of crisis, in moments of kind of insanity, basically. So it's, just to think about like how are children in Gaza really dealing with this on a daily basis, and especially when exposed to this kind of violence? How is that affecting them?
Some children survive, but you do wonder about the cost of living in such a place, in such a difficult place. And you can see why people leave and why people want to leave. And if you stay, how does that change you? If you're exposed to so much trauma, your entire life is very traumatic, then, how can you live your life when you just know that at any moment things could go wrong? And, it's really hard to understand how you can live through something like that. And I think what we see, not just in Gaza, in Syria, in everywhere, children are so traumatized that, that trauma stays with them for years. And even when they leave, and even when they, have kind of safe lives and secure lives in other places, I think you just never get over that kind of life, which is very depressing, but sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's hopefully, I mean, you hope that children can grow up and have a future and live a life and all that, at least. And I think that kind of that notion of, okay, now I'm an adult, what happened to me in the past? was talked a little bit about in The Long Braid, which is kind of this journalist kind of thinking about her past and imagining what it was like for her. And when she was younger, she really liked to sing and dance, and really that just wasn't taken well by her family, and she kind of imagines, I think, to some degree, what her life could have been. And to me, that is, or it was kind of linked with what we were just talking about, in the sense that, as an adult, you often think about how your life could have gone differently, and whether that was about, whether your creativity could have been expressed and you could have done that for a living maybe, or something more serious like we were talking about, where how would my life have been different if I didn't grow up amongst all this violence or something like that? Like what could have been better? And so, yeah, I guess, how can we, one thing I wanted to check in on is, like, how can we try and stay true to our younger selves? Like, whatever it was that we liked about our younger selves.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very tough question. I think when we're young, we have so many dreams and we all want to be astronauts before, you realize that you have to do like science and math and physics and all these things that,
it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. And, I think when things aren't available to you as an option, like for this girl who wanted to be a singer and who, wanted to just go and sing and dance and, be joyful, she just wasn't allowed to do that because, her teacher thinks a woman's voice shouldn't be heard. Like women should not be singing and people should be serious. And I think it's especially if you're brought up somewhere like Gaza, you're not allowed to just be a normal person. You have to have, ideals and want to fight. But what if you don't want to do that? What if you just want to be a singer and not have to, be a journalist and write about things that aren't related to violence and growing up, with all these other things going on, you're just not allowed to be normal. And, you have this double kind of responsibility and guilt because you just have so much on your shoulders to live up to. And, and also, I think it's very interesting because with The Long Braid, and there's another story, The Mirror with the...
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the same thing. Like when you look in the mirror and you have this aunt who's sitting with her little niece, and they're both, looking at the mirror, and they see completely different things because the little girl is just playing with the light and looking at herself. And you can tell she likes herself when she looks in the mirror, and to her, it's not so loaded. She looks in the mirror, she sees herself, she sees who she wants to be. But when the aunt looks in the mirror, it's just, she wonders about what her life could have been like if this horrible assault hadn't happened to her when she was a child. And, would she have been a different person, a happier person? The shame, I think, that you feel when you look in the mirror as an adult and as a child, they're just different experiences. And you just have to wonder what happens in someone's life when you get to that point, Is it ever smooth? Childhood to, adulthood? How do we get there?
Right. Yeah. Mirrors are very tricky things. That's for sure. Yeah. I mean, maybe just to wrap up all the stories. I mean, I also wanted to check in on breastfeeding because I thought that story was just super, super interesting. I mean, it's sort of just like it's a story about marriage and weddings and children, but it's layered with all these elements of tradition in different ways about, the tradition of what the woman should be doing and what the man should be doing, and who should be, spending time with whom and how, like, I don't know, maybe tradition / cultural norms is the right bigger bucket to put it in, but it seems so interesting to me that to think about all those different layers, like, what was your sense of how they all interacted and why they were all so important?
Well, I think with a story like breastfeeding, and I think most people, unless you grew up in Arab culture, don't know that, if a woman breastfeeds someone else's baby, and then that baby can't marry her own children. So it's a very interesting thing.
Hmm.
If the same woman breastfeeds two children and they're completely unrelated, they wouldn't be technically
Yeah.
allowed to get married. And I mean, it's I don't know why, but it's, I guess, Islamic culture. Maybe we don't know if it's Islamic or it's Arab or where exactly it comes from. So for
Hmm.
someone to discover that the person they married had been breastfed by her mother, then that marriage is void. And any children that resulted from that marriage, it doesn't matter. The husband can leave his wife. A woman can leave her husband, because then it's like discovering you're related, maybe closely related, I don't know. But I think also made me think about the whole idea about tradition and culture, and how it disproportionately affects women. It's always about women, and it's always about women's
Yeah.
bodies, and that's what tradition is. And men, tradition never seems to apply to men. It's always the woman. And it's and I think it's also in the story, this woman was not in a happy marriage, and then she encourages her daughter to go into another marriage that probably isn't going to be happy either. And it's just like the things we expose ourselves to, and then our children to, because you assume that at some point this mother would think twice about letting her daughter marry someone she doesn't know or she doesn't love. But no, she doesn't think like that. She just says, oh, well, you should be married because, that's the tradition. And a woman should listen to what her husband says, even if she's been wronged. And, it kind of puts things in perspective. And, you just think about how unfair it all is.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. I mean, I think this is the whole women's rights movement, right? Is that they're pushing back against these traditions that have been structured to be unfair to them. And so they're trying to get gains and be allowed to be free and, do things like vote, which was very difficult. There was a huge fight to allow women to vote, again, because of just like what you said, that, the tradition was. And,
yeah, exactly.
And that was then written into the law.
Yeah, when you think about it, it really doesn't seem to affect men. They always say it's the tradition, and then other women say it's our tradition. But then, how does it affect men? I don't know.
Well, they were the writers of the traditions,
exactly.
And they wrote it to benefit them, right?
Of course, it's always to their advantage. So it was kind of really sad, the story, because I thought, oh God, this is just terrible. This poor woman.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's clearly what, she was trying to get us to think about, is that this is a clear case of all this going very wrong, and I think, it's interesting to think about, but that's a lot of what this book is. It's, and I think probably that's what a lot of drama obviously is, right? It's not going to show you all the good stuff and everything going fine. Like, it wants to get across when things go wrong, right, and how they go wrong and why they go wrong. And I think this is a lot of what this book does very well, is it shows you how in Gaza, all the things that you think are easy in your life become very difficult and go wrong very easily. And that's one of the big takeaways I had, was that, across, all these different stories, every little thing, everyone's working so hard and trying to get, as scrape by, and, working within the boundaries of their religion, their culture, their geographical location. And it's just like a constant battle of some sort. Even if it's not a physical fight, there's a mental battle being waged.
I mean, I think the idea that the enemy is not always someone on the outside. The enemy is also you and your immediate family and your immediate culture and the traditions that you grew up with. It's not as simple as, the police are the enemy, or, politicians are the enemy. It's like, no, it's everyone. it can be anyone. It's not about the political situation. People have their own issues.
To kind of wrap things up, I was just a little curious if, across all of these stories, if any of them particularly resonated with you, if you really connected with any of them for any reason.
I think Summerland Moon, because I think, it's just about a couple driving and, they're just, I think, university students, and it feels like a very normal experience that you would have. You go to the beach and you're with your boyfriend or your partner and you're on the beach and you're just having a nice time. And then that person suddenly changes to become, completely religious or starts judging you for how you dress, based on, their family, what they think, based on their friends, and how that person can become, radicalized. And okay, maybe I don't have personal experience with that story, but I can see how it happens. And, I think we've all seen it happen with all the, the stories of people committing terrorist acts, and, their friends say, oh, but they were so normal, or they were completely not religious, but then all of a sudden they became very religious. They stopped doing all these things and they started saying, terrible things about other people. And then eventually they, kill someone. And I think that I was like, it was just shocking how they can go from being, having a normal existence, a normal life, and to becoming someone completely different because, they feel wronged.
So we've covered a lot today across the whole book and on all of this. Is there anything else that you really felt like was important to communicate about, your work as a translator, about the contents of the book, or anything else you sort of hoped people would get out of this?
Well, I mean, I think I guess I hope that people would read it and feel like it resonates with them, because it's not about a specific place, or it's not about women's issues specifically, or it's not about a specific issue, but it's just about a portrait of everyday life, and how, yes, people are different, but we all have the same fundamental feelings, and we all have the same human experience. And I think this book kind of does make you feel that way.
You're right. We are essentially exactly the same,
yes.
Actually, all of us, with just very minor,
with very minor
changes
tweaks.
Very minor tweaks. Yeah, totally. I hear you, and I think that is, like you said, a great reason for people to read the stories. Okay, so that was a lot of very intense.
Yeah, sorry about that.
stuff there. So let's end with it. No. That's as it should be. That's what this book is. But let's end with a thunder round, like I like to do, which we'll just do some a little bit lighter, getting to know you questions, and then we can call it a day. Okay?
Okay.
Okay. So first off, what is your favorite food or drink?
I'd like anything with eggplant dip, baked, fried. And yeah, I really like eggplant. It's my Egyptian upbringing, I think. We just have it for breakfast. I mean, we do have it for breakfast as a side.
Wow.
So yeah, it's good with garlic and chili.
Yeah, so are most things.
Yes, anything.
Yeah. Where is your favorite place you've ever been?
I think my favorite place is Alexandria in Egypt. I mean, I feel like I have to, because I'm from Cairo. I mean, I'm from Egypt, so I have to stay somewhere in Egypt. But no, I used to spend the summer there. I used to spend 2 to 3 months every summer in Alexandria, on the beach with friends, and everyone would go from Cairo, and, you'd see everyone in a little tiny place, and the food's amazing. The city is beautiful, and, the buildings. It's like really one of the few places in Egypt that still feels, like it hasn't been built up.
All right, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
It's really tricky. I mean, there's so many things to change in the world.
I know.
But I think obviously, inequality and making sure everyone has the same basic access to, an education, and not to be too, I don't know, I don't want to say tax the rich more, but, I think we should all have decent access to education, maternity leave, paternity leave. I think it's one of those things that is really, it's shocking. I think it's shocking how little we have in terms of leave for parents.
On that note, thanks so much, Perween. The book is The Sea Cloak, translated by Perween Richards, author Nayrouz Qarmout. And if you couldn't figure out, it is so interesting and fascinating, and will really make you think for a while. So thanks again for joining. Perween.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.